Hi, today I'm back in my office because I didn't reserve the other room, but hopefully it will do the trick. Today we're moving onward in the Renaissance into the Elizabethan period, into the reign of Queen Elizabeth, widely considered a golden age in the literature of England. This is when such famous authors as Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney and not Philip Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe and what's his name? William Shakespeare wrote. It was a period of peace, rising prosperity, and power for the English nation. Although that prosperity was not evenly distributed, it was still a period of frequent famine and starvation and social conflict, of rebellion and all kinds of issues going on. It's a very interesting period. There's a book by Peter Ackroyd called The Tudors, which is a pretty swift history of the period if you're into history. But we're going to focus in on one particular guy in this short lecture. His name was Philip Sidney, and he's one of the most important and influential poets of the Elizabethan period. Pictured right here is Philip Sidney, author of Defense of Poesy, Astrophil and Stella, and many other important works of literature. He is among other things, a fancy pants. You can see him in his fancy pants here. He was a member of the elite nobility, but not very wealthy. He was somebody whose title had outlasted their capital, but had what the French sociologist Bourdieu, the term he coined, social capital, which is the ability to sort of get preferment and position and privilege based on your name and connections. He was the nephew of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who was a favorite of Elizabeth. And not only the favorite, she was the childhood friend of Queen Elizabeth. They were rumored even to have been lovers, or at least had wanted to be lovers. Sidney is one of the first people to go on a tour of Europe at 18, initiating or being one of the first generations of Englishmen to carry out this activity that would one day become a sort of standard thing for the upper class to do. And in the 20th century, it survives in a middle class form in terms of North America, in terms of the study abroad type thing. He enters Oxford in 1568 to 71, but never finishes a degree. One of his first works was The Lady of May, a court masque. The masque is an interesting phenomenon. It was a form of kind of participatory theater / party which was popular among the aristocracy of the 16th century. In it, the members of the court would dress up in costumes and take on roles and participate in songs and dance. It was a combination of the participatory theater, and there was a cosplay element to it, if you know what I mean. Henry VIII, one of the first court masques recorded, was organized on the theme of Robin Hood and his merry men, and they all dressed up like bandits and stuff like that. Sidney is described in all the records as being the most perfect, noble, gallant courtier. He was a diplomat, a soldier, a scholar. He was everything. He was all the ideals that were embodied in that we were talking about last week in terms of the Book of the Courtier, and all that gallantry and heroism, and also his passionate commitment to the cause of Protestantism against Catholicism, which was the great sort of struggle of the 16th century, got him killed because he went to fight the Spanish, who were the Catholic superpower of the age, in the Netherlands, which was the sort of scrappy underdog fighting for its independence against Spain. And so the English were fighting kind of a proxy war and sometimes an open war against Spain in the Netherlands. And he was shot in the thigh and died of gangrene 26 days later at the age of 31, leaving behind him a rich legacy of work. I have often taught, but did not assign this class, his work called A Defense of Poesy, which was published in 1595. In it, he argues that poesy, by which he broadly means what we would refer to as literature, fiction, stories, narrative. He argues that this is an important kind of human activity, and that it's worth defending, that it is a way of knowing the world that offers value distinct from philosophy, theology, natural philosophy, which is what they used to call science, and law. It was another mode of apprehending truth, and in fact, in some ways, it was superior to philosophy and history. The poet, argued Sidney, is the apprehender of ideas, that he takes ideas and fashions them into sensible, perceptible form. The skill of every artificer, he writes, standeth in that idea or foreconceit of the work, and not in the work itself. And so in Sidney and in other Renaissance poets, we see a foretaste of the romantic idea, the idea in literary romanticism that imagination more than craftsmanship or artisanship is really at the soul of literature. And he talks about how, the historian will talk about the real Cyrus, who is a legendary Persian king, and in ancient writing was often held up as an ideal kind of king. If you guys listen to podcasts, there's a great show called Hardcore History by Dan Carlin with a 3-part series called The King of Kings, which talks all about Cyrus and the founding of the ancient Persian dynasty. But the ancient sources hold up Cyrus as this really just effective, capable, amazing monarch. And so Sidney is talking about Cyrus and why he matters, and how, the historians leave us a legacy of or a record of the actual Cyrus. The philosophers talk about the moral attributes and virtues that make Cyrus such a great king, but the poet can do best of all by making a version, a poetic fiction of the ideal that is rememberable through senses, through narrative, and which can then bring forth that idea into the world more readily than either the philosopher or the historian can. And so he not only is defending poesy or literature, but saying that it has a higher function or a higher calling even than forms of knowledge and learning that had traditionally been more prestigious. And he comes up with this idea of ut pictura poesis. He doesn't come up with it. This phrase is taken from the ancient Roman poet Horace in his art of poetry, which Sidney's kind of updating. The idea is poetry as a mimesis. This is one of your terms for this week. And he writes, "Poesy, therefore, is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle termeth it in the word mimesis. That is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture, with this end, to teach and delight." Now this idea of poetry, of literature, as being for the purpose of instructing and delighting, of both teaching and also entertaining, is a classic formulation for what the purpose of literature is, that goes back to the ancient world and goes straight through the Middle Ages. Chaucer will describe the purpose of his Canterbury Tales as providing both sentence or meaning or wisdom, but also solace, pleasure. And Sidney is carrying forward this idea. One small note of the language, by the way. This giveth after verbs. You should know that you don't just make an early modern verb by throwing eth at the end of any word. He liketh, I thinketh, I doeth. That's only the third person. If you studied French or Spanish or German, you know how verbs are conjugated. Ich will, du willst, will, I forget. Yo hablo, tu hablas, él habla. Well, early modern English, like Middle English, has conjugated verbs as well. I think, thou thinkest, he thinketh, we think, ye think, they think. So bear that in mind. Don't just sort of, if you want to ever write something, like you're a creative writer and you want to write old-timey stuff, don't just do it randomly. Look it up, or better yet, take my History of English Language course. Anyway. Anyway, this idea of instructing and delighting is related to its capacity to imitate reality, to imitate nature. This is the idea of the mimetic or mimesis. And this is what Aristotle said literature was for, that drama was the imitation of action. And Aristotle, of course, is the source of this idea of mimesis, but it's an idea that really becomes powerful in Elizabethan poetry, and it's something we see, for example, in Hamlet, where Hamlet is talking to the players, to the actors who come to Elsinore, and says to them, hold a mirror up to nature. This is the idea of mimesis. Now, of course, mimesis always involves a certain degree of selection, that there's things that we leave out and there's things that we put in, right? And of course, this is in your sheet, but the literary critic Northrop Frye talks about the high mimetic versus the low mimetic. Where the high mimetic, like a superhero movie, or romance of a certain kind, or a legal thriller, doesn't show people at their kind of like everyday sweatpantsy sort of grottiness. It shows people in a kind of more idealized way. It's people in tuxedos being beautiful and always being elegant and always speaking correctly. Whereas the low mimetic, whereas the high mimetic belongs to, tragedy and epic and more sort of idealized forms, the low mimetic belongs to comedy and satire. And it does show us in our sort of stained sweatpants, kind of everyday, like eating chicken wings out of a styrofoam carton kind of way. And both of those are representations of reality. I mean, both those things are part of the experience of the world. So mimesis it holds up a mirror, but it's never a mirror without distortion. Astrophil and Stella is Philip Sidney's take on the cycle of sonnets, the sequence of sonnets. He goes much farther than Thomas Wyatt in trying to do what Petrarch did with the sonnet, which was to give a treatment of courtly love between two lovers with a strong narrative thread that is philosophical in temperament and reflective. And it is written, just like Wyatt's poems were, for a coterie audience. That is, for a select group of people in the know, many of whom he probably would have known himself, who were either friends or friends of friends. Sidney would not... He would view writing for a press to sell as prostituting himself, quite frankly. Sidney is a real aristocrat, and it's hard to recreate the sense that they had of just how much above common people the gentry and the aristocracy were. But this, I mean, especially for a democratic culture like ours, but in Renaissance England, your betters were really considered to be your betters. And this is the term, in fact, when aristocracy is first used, as opposed to simply nobility or gentleman or gentilesse. An aristocracy is this term from Greek that means ruled by the aristoi, by the best. There's this idea that if you're rich and powerful, you really are better than other people. So, and that's a great way for justifying the existing social order. Anyway, Astrophil and Stella is a series of sequences that he writes, where the lover takes on the identity of Astrophil. That is, the one who loves a star, and Stella is Latin for stars. So there's a kind of allegorical frame going on here. And in it, he sort of does that whole thing where he develops his own subjectivity, he contemplates itself, he climbs the ladder of love, and then, we'll see what happens. I've given you a small sample of the poems to read. Here is the original spelling, which I think is a little bit different than in your book, but look on with your book. It's actually on page 1084 in your Norton Anthology. Loving in truth, and fain in verse my love to show, And fain here means like desiring, I wanting to, being inclined to. Loving in truth and fain in verse my love to show, that she, dear she, might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read. Reading might make her know. Knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe, studying inventions fine, her wits to entertain, oft turning others' leaves, to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. But words came halting forth, wanting invention's stay. Invention, nature's child, fled stepdame study's blows, and others' feet still seemed but strangers in my way. Thus, great with child, to speak, and helpless in my throes, biting my truant pen, beating myself for spite. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. Now every sonnet has an argument. It has a point that it's trying to make. What is the argument of this sonnet? What is Philip Sidney trying to say? How does the poem change at the volta? And where will the volta come? Well, there's the first quatrain. Show, pain, know, obtain. Well, we can see the sonnet form is a little different than why it's here already. The second quatrain, woe, entertain, flow, brain. But, right, there is our turn, right? And the turn often involves a kind of adversative, kind of contrary or a shifting. So there's our volta, right? How does the poem change here? What happens? Is there a ruling metaphor? Is there some overall kind of figurative pattern of images or conceit, some extended idea that's used to represent the ideas in this poem? And to focus that in more quickly, or more closely, let's ask this. What is invention, and how does it relate to nature and study? So I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe. He's talking about trying to write here. What would be the suitable words to express my grief? The grief of, the typical courtly love grief of not being able to obtain the pity or the grace of his beloved. So first he studies inventions fine. Turning others' leaves. Leaves here meaning like what? Like pages, right? The leaf of a book is the page, and like folio or feuille in French. So I was reading other people's poems to see if maybe they would inspire me with fresh and fruitful showers. But words came halting, wanting invention's stay. Invention, nature's child, fled stepdame study's blows. So, okay, we got this like kind of little allegory going on here where we have nature is the mother of invention, but the stepmother is study. So what is invention then? Well, invention, I mean, in the tradition of teaching literature and teaching how to write and how to read that Sidney would have been part of, invention was the first part of rhetoric. Invention was finding a suitable topic or a suitable concept in order to express one's ideas, one's thoughts, one's argument. The word did not have this idea of total out-of-the-blue creativity that we ascribe to it when we think of inventors like Edison or Tesla or whatever. But invention comes from a Latin word, invenire, which means literally to come upon or to find. So there's this idea of composition, of writing as a matter of finding the right thing, right? And he says that here, I sought fit words. Sought is to seek. But invention's not working, right? Because invention, he's saying, is the mother of nature, but study is beating invention and making invention fly away. So maybe there's this idea of mimesis involved here somehow, where mimesis is holding up a mirror to nature, but if we're only studying other people's literary works, how can we look to nature? Others' feet still seemed but strangers in my way. And this here is a pun on feet, where feet is a pattern of rhythm in a poem, right? Thus, great with child to speak. And this is one of a number of instances in the early modern period where a man will talk about the creative process as giving birth. And throes here is referring to the pain of birth. So here he is, great with child, in the pain of birth. And I love this little bit business of biting a pen. Who here has ever bitten a pen while they're trying to think of something to write or to say? Beating myself for spite, and then, fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. And we can see we can see how the Romantics really looked to the Elizabethans as models to them. This idea of inspiration and creativity. This is really something that comes about during this period where writing becomes something more than a kind of artisanship. It's not simply a matter of arranging traditional materials into a new and entertaining pattern, but involves this idea of figuring forth, this idea of the poet as being somebody whose capacity to create and bring forth into the world is in fact itself an imitation of gods, right? This word poesy is related to the Greek word poesis, which is the word for creation. So not going to get too deep into all of these sonnets, but a couple things to look forward or to look into is in Sonnet 2. What is all this business about conquest or tyranny? How does the ruling metaphor of war develop courtly love in this? What is he talking about in Sonnet 5 when he talks about inward light and the temple of our love? Does this relate in some way to what we learned last week about Platonism? In Sonnet 21, who is he talking to? I think there's somebody different here than the person who, than the Stella, than the beloved. What is the implicit dialogue? What is implied about what's being said to him? What is the dramatic situation of the poem? In Sonnet 45, what is he talking about when he says, I am not I? What is that I-ness that he's talking about? And how does it relate to this emerging idea of subjectivity, of this sort of unique, inexpressible, and unrepeatable selfhood that comes to be so important to literature and literary expression? A couple more questions which you can see here. Who is the addressee in 47? And what does he mean when he says that Stella hath of her high heart given me the monarchy in Sonnet 79? The last sonnet I want to look at very briefly is number 71, which really talks about this the problem with Platonism, the problem with the ladder of love, and the difficulty in this idea of transcending physical desire and physical beauty through physical desire and physical beauty. And he writes, who will in fairest book of nature know how virtue may best lodged in beauty be? Sounds like Bembo from the Courtier, right? Who will in fairest book of nature know how virtue may best lodged in beauty be? Let him but learn of love to read in thee, Stella, those fair lines which true goodness show. So, in other words, let's put this in sort of a regular prose order. Let those who want to know in the fairest book of nature how virtue is living in beauty, let that person read those fair lines which show true goodness in thee. Remember what I said about convoluted syntax in the Petrarchan tradition here. You got to kind of scramble it. Look for your subjects and your verbs and be patient. So, yeah, learn to read in thee those fair lines. There shall he find all vices overthrow, not by rude force, but sweetest sovereignty of reason, from whose light those night birds fly, that is, the vices, those are the night birds. That inward sun in thine eyes shineth so. That inward sun is that spirit, that soul that unites us with the highest good of being in the Platonic tradition. Not by rude force, but sweetest sovereignty of reason, from whose light those night birds fly. Remember the role of reason in knowledge of the world, according to the Neoplatonism in the Book of the Courtier. That inward sign and sun in thine eyes shineth so, and not, content to be perfection's heir thyself, dost strive all minds that way to move. So not only is her virtue so perfect and good, but she's not content to be perfection's heir herself. That is, it's not enough for her to be good in herself alone, but strives all minds to move towards goodness. And this is another Platonic idea too, the idea that good is bountiful of itself. Good is not like perfectly self-sufficient and content, but always wants to generate goodness for others. This is particularly strong in the Christian humanist tradition that combines Platonism with Christianity. Because it's very easy to reconcile this idea of the bountifulness of good with the idea of God's free grace. And of course, Sidney is a very devout Christian as well. And a Protestant Christian of a type for whom the idea of grace is extremely important. We're going to talk more about that when we get to Marlowe. So, while thy beauty draws thy heart to love, as fast thy virtue bends that love to good. All great, right? This is exactly how it works. You're supposed to, your beauty draws thy heart to love, and that brings you to virtue and to good, and yay, I'm climbing the ladder of love. I'm a platonic courtly lover and a good courtier and all that stuff. But, and he kind of saves the volta to the very end. But, I love that one syllable, that inarticulate cry of the body, right? Desire still cries. Give me some food. Where does food fit into reason and understanding? Food belongs to the realm of the appetite, to the realm of the body. It belongs to that which doesn't ascend, right? So has all of Sidney's work been for nothing? Is all of this him simply talking himself into this Platonic scheme, but in fact, he wants to be Bembo, but really he's with Morello. Sorry, Bembo. Desire is about making babies. It's about satisfying your body. I don't know. I don't find it personally to be resolved, and I think that's one of the things that makes it interesting. I think the great literature, the literature that keeps us coming back, is the literature that doesn't answer questions, but poses them in a powerful and moving way. And Sidney is one of the people that does this, but Shakespeare does too. And Shakespeare is going to come at this whole Platonic tradition and this whole idea of the ladder of love from a very different perspective. We'll have a look at that too. We'll have a look at the sonnets of Shakespeare and his take on desire, love, passion, and the quarrel between the reason and the senses. Thank you for joining me.